everyone who's here, welcome to this edition of QCGU Big Ideas. It sort of has a loose title of What Next in Music, which hopefully we'll get around to as we talk through the kind of the practices that we undertake here and elsewhere. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and to welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Today we were supposed to have a more diverse panel. Sadly, our wonderful lecturer in composition, Nicole Murphy, can't be with us today. So instead, we have Tom Green. We also have John Ferguson, and we have Erik Griswold joining us to talk about generally what this topic might mean, what next in music. I've taken that a little bit in the questions that we'll be exploring as a little bit about, in a kind of a broad sense, what next in music. Where are we now with music making? How does it matter? How does it connect us to this time and place? Where's it come from? And then looking more maybe then to thinking about how our music practice might evolve and has this sort of relevance into the future, or how we see individually perhaps the relevance of our practice as it moves forward into the next 10, 15, 20 years. I might just start by getting ourselves to introduce ourselves. My name's Ben Marks. I'm the head of brass here at the Conservatorium, and have sort of did my doctorate in outdoor music making and a number of other things like that, and I've just got back from playing a lot of interesting concerts in Sydney and Melbourne, some operas by Lisa Lim and concerts in Melbourne by of a big piece of Lisa Lim, so I've had a really wonderful time as a member of Elysian. Erik Griswold, I'm just going to put some words in your mouth. I'm particularly going to read from your QCGU, a little bit from your either websites and QCGU profiles. Erik, you say your works are very focused on hybrid practice, which I find a really interesting term in terms of where music might be heading in the future. And yeah.
So hybridity.
Yes.
Musical hybridity. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that growing up in Southern California, I was certainly surrounded by all of these musical influences, from rock to West Coast jazz to classical, and I was very interested in contemporary classical. And so it was quite natural for me to want to be drawing across all of those different genres. And then, in addition to that, I was fortunate to become involved because I grew up in San Diego, which is on the border of Mexico. So I became involved with the border arts workshops there. And it's really all just the right place, the right time. It's really just, location, just about where I was and looking around and acknowledging what was there. And so that set me on a path of collaborating, with artists and poets involved in that scene. And so that, so that was kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is this idea of hybridity was very much just a circumstance of where I was, where I grew up, and just looking at what was there in the world.
So the idea of borderlands in your music, you talked that about in relationship to your practice with prepared piano and finding sounds that are sort of between the cracks a little. I mean, this is sort of relating to how you grew up as much as your practice, that these things sort of somehow cross.
Between the cracks, yeah, on the edges, on the border, in between ecosystems. This is, I think, often where a lot of interesting things occur. Ecologists talk about that zone, those transitional zones. For example, in between the forest and the paddock, or in between, mountain and coastal. And these exact zones, these interstitial zones, are often the place where you have an abundance of diversity and also uniqueness. So you tend to find really unique species in those zones. So I guess it's a metaphor. in terms of my artistic practice, I'm also drawn to those in-between places, and so that has definitely informed my practice. And I've found that Australia was a particularly interesting place to be, bringing that approach. And I've found a lot of, like-minded people carrying on a similar type of exploration. I mean, particularly like, you think Australia is so far away from much of the rest of the world geographically, maybe culturally, but in fact, what my experience was that not only did you have sort of obviously a connection with English culture, but you also had a lot of people very fluent in American culture. You had a lot of people very fluent in a lot of Asian cultures, and then fortunately, an increasing awareness and understanding and engagement of our own First Nations cultures. And so I think this has been something that I've watched and learned a lot from my Australian colleagues, also interested in exploring those in-between zones.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll just keep moving, John. Again, to steal something from your blurb on the if I can open my page, that'd be better. You talk about being a post-digital electronic musician, and you go on to explain a bit about that, but I wonder if you could put that in your words. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Ooh, that's loud. Post-digital. Yeah, that's going back a while now. There's a Thames and Hudson book called like Digital Art, and like the entire thing is, everything's out there on the internet. I'm going back like 20 years or maybe 25 years, and it talks about everything which is supposedly exciting about the digital, which is there's a lack of proxemics, there's a lack of touch, but everything's instant, everything's fast. For me, post-digital becomes interesting, and it is borrowing from Kim Kaskone's notion, kind of around post-digital, but it's got a few different uses of misuse, of failure. So things like you can coerce a CD player to misbehave by giving it a good whack. You can put little tiny bits of sticky tape on it and it becomes physical. Since Apple came along and took away the CD tray that would come out and you had to physically put the disc in, things become less kind of material and you just kind of push it inside. So, I mean, I've always been interested in technology rather than necessarily digital technology, how it extends, how it challenges. So for me, post-digital is a really interesting space where you can get inside and remake, you can hack, you can think of wood as a productive destination. Like if you are carving a piece of wood, you're going to align it with the grain. You're not going to carve a swan and then have the grain going across its neck because it's just going to break. To me, that's how we have to investigate technology rather than just use it. In other words, we can make albums out of CDs rather than just making CDs as albums.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I wonder, I remember seeing one of your works and the colour and the sort of wanting to touch it, and it had its own sort of life to it, like it occupies its own space without necessarily referencing anything else. Is it also like a reaction to the way we consume media in some sense, the work that you make? Like Spotify, playlists and that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, it can be. Yeah, let me think about that. I guess the way I want to answer that is to do with like a lot of my work is live performance based, even if it does involve media, and I think that is just in my head. That's normal. No, wait, Erik gave a great big long thing about history. I don't advertise my guitar playing abilities because I don't practice anymore, but my background is playing rock and roll and heavy metal in bands many years ago. So that notion of like collaboration and making something without knowing what that's going to be, which is just what happens when bands plug in, tune up and start playing, that drives kind of everything for me. It's still like my starting point in making music. So going back to Christopher Small's music as verb and all the rest of it, it's more an embracement of that than a reaction to making fixed objects, but
Yeah.
but that's in there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was thinking more in it has that sort of sculptural space, like it lives in almost the, like sound sculptural aspect of a presentation in that, that context perhaps, yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to be a sculptor.
Yeah, I think I understand that too.
If you don't mind my saying, a lot of your work's really participatory as well. I mean, I think that's an important aspect of the works that I know.
Yeah, I mean, let's quote Vanessa, choose your own adventure. I always think that's such a nice way of putting things forward. But yeah, in building interactive things that I get to play with is a big part of my practice, but building things and curating scenarios for other people to play within, I do think is also really important. Yeah, I haven't done much of that recently. We should make something, Erik.
Definitely, and if we're heading into I'm preempting the discussion, but if we're talking about musical futures, I think, more participatory works is definitely a productive future.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think if nothing else comes of this, that'd be great. Nice new collaboration. Tom, I've done very little research, but to bring something from your thing, a musical home between many varied streams, often seamlessly melding classical and contemporary idioms.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I like the word classical. It's what I grew up with, so I'm sticking with it. I think Erik mentioning this place as likely to draw like-minded people resonated with me. It's very true for today and for always at the con. And actually, Erik and John both spoke about things which are dear to my heart and in my own mind very, very closely related. So John mentioned a paper by Kim Cascone, which I think is called The Aesthetics of Failure. And I love the title of that paper because I'm very familiar with failure. And he talks about glitch. And I think about the way that I've glitched my life on occasion. And glitch is such a great word. It can be a failure at any given time of the day. And it's something that tends to happen when things aren't aligned quite right. And that is where those gaps are. And that's the exciting place to be as far as I'm concerned. Did I draw that together nicely, those two conversations? So, yeah, it's an adventure with failure as a distinct possibility at every turn. And the adventure is, in part, discovering what it might mean for this thing to be here and this thing to be here, and whether anybody else can see it the way I see it, and whether I'm seeing it in a way which is valid or might fall on its head later on, and I'll only discover that years later. That adventure is what music is to me. I know people who move away from music. They say they've gotten bored with it. I think if they understood that music is who you are and your relationships with other people, and I mean that absolutely literally, then you can't get bored of it. And that's where I am. Anyway, that was a very poetic introduction.
Oh, that's wonderful. Just looking down the panel, it struck me that we're not very score-based, perhaps, in our practice. I think it's maybe a little bit different with maybe Erik and Tom to some degree, but that we all share something of an improvisatory kind of practice. You talk about the glitch probably, I assume, being in the moment of something occurring. I think, there's score-based things where Bert Whistle will talk about a mistake as being a cue for something in his compositional practice. But I think as improvisers, that glitch is something that's a possibility that also really emerges in that space, perhaps. And obviously, John, with your work, the hands-on and participatory thing, I don't imagine exists as a score. It exists as a set of sort of outcomes, which should be sort of a kind of a score, a possible range of possibilities. And
I mean, if you really want me to answer that, I could argue that the digital recording is the only accurate form of score, but I feel like that's going to get me in trouble. But like something like John Zorn's Cobra, which of course isn't scored, but shares democratically amongst the ensemble a whole bunch of agreed instructions and memories and storing. In fact, I think I just saw that Martin's going to run that as a module, which is really great. Sorry, yes.
Yeah. And Erik,
well, yeah. I mean, I think a score is a mnemonic device and a set of instructions. You know, and in some cases it's more of one and more of the other. But you know, and obviously the style and the content and the information, you know, of a score has changed a lot over you know, the last 1,000 years of what's expected. But I think the three of us probably, although yes, Tom and I both work in notated forms, I think the three of us probably tend to locate the work in the moment of performance. And so a lot of the work that we do, you know, can't be captured very accurately in the score because there's a larger degree of information that exists outside the score. I think, for example, if you think of prepared piano, I can give the instructions for how you prepare the piano, but what you read in the score doesn't actually look like the music. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And as you point out, of course, there's an improvisational aspect in a lot of works, and I think that probably is something we all share, but of course varies from work to work.
No, I think Adorno. I think it's Adorno talking about a score, and I think it's Schumann writing espressivo in a piece of music as a kind of a shock that the need to write something as expressive implies some loss of information. That why wouldn't this be expressive in some way? It was a sort of a comment that shocked me when I read it at the time, and that had a lot to do with tradition. You know, that there's certain traditions of music that have a sort of way of doing the practice inherent in them. And I wonder nowadays whether, like, each composer is almost their own. Is their own tradition, but I'm sure we all have our shared backgrounds. But I'm curious what you think about that, maybe. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, we saw. Well, I mean, in a way, maybe in my view, we may have reached a peak, you know, modernity of scores, perhaps in the 60s, where we had these incredibly beautiful, graphically laid out scores, which by the way were often not necessarily just the product of one hand. I mean, like in the case of John Cage, his handwriting is so famous that we are actually seeing his you know, physical imprint in the scores, but on the other hand, there were other composers who worked with, and it's not a very well-known history, but you know, who worked with graphic designers in designing their scores. And I think I'm a little fuzzy on my history lesson, but I think Lutoslawski was in that situation where, like, some of his scores, which I think are magical, like just incredibly, you know, intricately constructed scores. It was actually collaborative, like, so it wasn't actually his hand that produced some of those things. But anyway, back to your original point, in that period, I agree, it's like every composer became an island in a sense in the sort of information, getting back to this idea of what information is present in the score. And so it's like each composer had to present a glossary and legend and dictionary, you know, at the beginning of their score, so that you would have so you'd be oriented to navigate the music.
Yeah. Is in that way that maybe the music we create has to somehow be self-explanatory in some way, that it doesn't necessarily reference something else. I mean, I think it's perhaps more obvious with yours, John. I think for some reason I feel like it occupies its own world, or it has its own. Your interaction with it uncovers its story.
I can
or Tom, yeah.
jump in on this point because I've got a fun anecdote. But I had to change my opinion about scored and notated music at one stage when I was asked to write music for a group which included some classical players who were very good friends of mine. And, you know, as I said before, music is about relationships. Music isn't about relationships. Music is relationships. And that's what drives me as a composer. So when I asked this player, would they be okay with 8 bars of improvising or just kind of making this bit up just for 8 bars, I was given a pretty firm talking to. This was not my training. I have not trained to improvise. I've spent 20 years playing in an orchestra. I can play any scale you want. I can read anything you want. Don't ask me to improvise. It's not my job. So I didn't. And it changed the way that I thought I was thinking about that piece. And it reminded me that the notation is in service of relationships, which is the music. So that's, when it comes to notation, for some people, it's a beautiful thing. It's close to their heart. It's part of who they are, and I have to be respectful about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah,
No, just a little bit. As usual, not sure what I'm trying to say with this, but it's interesting thinking about the site of music, like the location, or like where the music is in all of these things, which I guess I'm reading a little bit from what you're both saying here. And I mean, I do quite a lot of audiovisual work using a ridiculously complicated program called Touch Designer to make these moving graphics. And then I presume we have Notations 21 in the library here, or whatever that beautiful book is, which I keep pulling off my shelf and realizing, oh, all of this graphical score stuff, which is so intricately done, when I try and get close to that with computer graphics, it's really, really hard. And this gets me thinking about some work slightly with Erik and maybe with Chris, and about how can we be putting imagery forward, which is at the very least a catalyst for the music, but perhaps also like an interrupter or a moment of agency or something we respond to that is shared with the audience as well. So I've always been interested in the notion of audiovisual as in changing the relationship with the musicians that are live on stage. This is not a project I can speak to that I finished and have good examples of, but it's the interaction between the visual, the memory, the gesture in the mind, like the, not that I'm an artist who draws with pen and paper, but the visual gesture and the sonic gesture, how they can be pulled apart to make something which can then be the same piece. And because this would be a criticism of some of my own improvised work of myself. Do I like any of the things that I made 10 years ago? At least when I start really generating an audiovisual, I'm going to say world rather than score right now, but if I generate an audiovisual world, I can more easily maintain my relationship with that sonic world and return to it, even though I don't think of any of these things as notations. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm rambling, but I think there was a moment of sense, so I'll pause.
I think it's really interesting, John, and it seems like twice in your discussion you brought us into this idea of, there's digital world, but then there are these analog tools, and I'm feeling like you brought it up as you're in between space between the digital and between the physical, right, objects, and I think that there's a tendency when one is working in the digital domain to want to be 100% digital, because I don't know, there's something clean or easy about that, or you can do it all in a virtual space. But actually, it's not necessarily where we find the most interesting results. So you just point out, if you do unless you're a highly skilled digital graphic artist, like you're not going to get the detail that you would get from using analog material, from using paints, from using using physical masking of shapes and so forth. So what I'm getting is like that how important it is to not just like discard those older technologies, but in fact to like, and that I think is we're kind of getting to what I think is one of our key roles as artists, is actually to curate and to find those connections between the old, physical models and the current technological tools, and to find those new spaces. And that's I think that's a thread that's running through the discussion.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting thing you bring up, like where where new music is, like not thinking about the process or how we might generate it, but is there a new music that we might imagine? I think of Tom, with your work with working with Nozomi that I've seen is this sort of melding, like you mentioned, melding of styles. John with the sculptural, and Erik, I think of your music as sort of being kind of long in duration, perhaps, like you experience your pieces in a certain way. Whether that's something that we're looking at as a sort of, is that what we're still after, or are we still looking for the new thing?
That's a good question.
Hard to find new sounds, but I reckon.
Yeah.
I reckon. That's what I'm still going after. I mean, it's one thing. It's more than just the new sound. I do sometimes think, maybe that's an old-fashioned way of thinking. I remember my teacher, Joji Iwasa, was very passionately interested in creating new sound, being the first person to do something. And I remember he showed me this, in one of our lessons, he showed me this, it was this, I can't even remember exactly, but it was this kind of a double string tremolo technique. And it was, or maybe it was a string tremolo, but it was glissandoing at the same time, and it's something I can't quite picture how it was doing it. And he was so excited about it because he was the first person to ever do this, And I think by my generation, I think it was kind of really harder and harder to do that, and so I think a lot of people younger than me probably aren't thinking that way because it just wasn't something, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to hear later on from some, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's an amazing little anecdote because you do have that sense of that generation seeking the new intentionally. But what was more interesting to me about that anecdote was that he was so excited by it. And I think that's where we can think about what new means, because you can be newly energized about something. And I do think that when you're creating music in an academic context, this novelty, this new way of thinking, this doing something new is essential to our fabric, but it doesn't, it can mean different things. You can be newly energized, for example, or you can build a new kind of relationship, or you can think about a new kind of audience, or you can think about working in a new space. And so when we approach it that way, then there's no end to the novelty. In fact, we're obliged to move forward into that newness.
That's really well articulated, and I almost think like all that matters is the energizing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter at all whether anyone else knows you were the first. Well, I mean, obviously Joji was excited to share it, but it was just the excitement was the energy.
Yeah, that's great. I guess with also this idea of new music is that are we thinking in essentially human new music? The coming of AI or AGI driven by LLMs, large language models and the like, which are very good at predicting answers, might to some extent mirror a process of creation. But AI at the moment doesn't seem to want to create. We ask it to do things. But could we imagine an AGI wanting to create something? And if it did, what does that say about, would that say about us?
Can I slightly derail that question?
Yes.
Sorry. I do feel energized by Tom's and Eric's, like newly energized. I don't know if I care about doing anything that's actually new. If something that is new to me, that's going to get me more excited than anything else. As a guitar player with not the best intonation, I definitely have no business near a cello or a violin. My intonation will never be that good. But the first time I just hung out with a couple of mics on a double bass in a reverberant room and like really heard with my ear there, like the sound of the hair on the string. It's one of the most compelling like sonic experiences ever. Now, I'm never going to be an expert in that instrument, but I could still compose and record with it. Anyway, this is going to connect back to this point a little bit, I hope. I just came from New Interfaces for Musical Expression in London, and what irritates me about that field, which comes from human-computer interaction, because I also peer-reviewed for them, is the word novel. I quite liked how you two used novel, but novel often gets used in that way of, oh, it's novel. There's your research output. It's novel. Job done. I wish we could look towards new in that field a little bit more. Now, of course, that field is becoming increasingly excited by AI, but it's interestingly taking a musician-centric approach, and it's actually less interested in large language models. It's interested in small language models, i.e., what about if we take these sensors, or even just a microphone as a sensor, and you read one person? So what about if you actually build a one-to-one relationship between a very small computer, which is not connected to the internet, is not connected to anything like that, and you are just getting it to reflect yourself. So there's a whole like subset, which I forget what it stands for, but the acronym is RAVE, which I quite like, which runs in Max environments, PD environments. Anyway, we don't really care about that, but there is freely available really good software for doing small language learning of yourself to kind of, and you know, some of this is not that new. Some of it has been going on for 20, 25 years. We had an honour student recently here called Finn, who went back to software called Wekinator to have it learn gestures. That still runs, and this is why sometimes the free and the open source software becomes really, really important, because many people use it. It has histories and legacies. So yeah, I guess the new can be the small language, and then also I think we have to really start and ask where this data is going, what are we connecting to, how could we harness, and I mean, I do have a couple of PhD students working actively on the type of programs that we may all have to love to hate in the future that do literally generate pretty bland, bad music, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Tom?
Well, I mean, there's what is the case now versus what is the case in 5 years from now. And I think one of the interesting things is that nobody on this planet can tell you what that will be. I used to I still do read a lot of science fiction, and one of the nice things about reading historical science fiction is you get all the predictions of the future. And interestingly, they're right in some ways. Sometimes they hit on a grain of truth, but they very frequently absolutely wrong in their predictions of the future. So I never trust, because of my science fiction reading, I never trust futuristic predictions that are very, very certain of themselves. Certain billionaires come to mind. So what is the case now? He said, would they want to do this? Well, AI doesn't want to do anything. AI has got no self-reflective capability, and using the term in a way that we're familiar with, it doesn't do music. It doesn't, it produces some material, which is different from doing music. That's all I'll say about it.
And I think that's an interesting thing, and I think we've all talked about in terms of collaborative music making and working with people, that the idea of making music isn't AI asking to make soundtrack or whatever you want AI. That's not music as we're talking about it. We're talking about music as a collective action, if that's the right word. Something that is human in the sense that we make it with other human beings, and that the results of that music are generative of that, perhaps. Would we all sort of...
Well, I think that music, when you say music, you can have a dream of music. You don't need any sound. You can imagine music in your head. You can have a conversation with somebody which is musical. These are all things which are intrinsic to being a human. So just because we can produce results which are reminiscent of music doesn't mean the AI made music. So, I mean, I know that it produces dodgy pop music. I'm not oblivious to that. I know that's probably threatening for, portions, people who are creators in the world. But, with every technology, there's ups and downs, and we will see.
Yeah, I know from my daughter's generation, there's a sort of almost an anti
there is
feeling towards some of these processes as well, that it's like, let's avoid that. And I'm just curious where that then, it's not so much what AI does, but more what we do in response to that as artists, I find interesting.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, yeah, I'm just echoing what's been being said, that AI is not going to come up with anything new by itself in its current form, but people using AI can come up with new things. So, I mean, and then you see this happening, and my friend, the maths professor, tells me that there are all kinds of equations that have been solved. There are all kinds of discoveries that have been solved with, very highly skilled, top of their field mathematicians using AI to assist them in, with these developments. So, I mean, we can see that. I can see that happening. I think in music, but particularly, like at this point, I would say particularly in recording studio, in post-production. I see that as an area that people are putting a lot of money and time into. So, I mean, I think we will hear sounds that we haven't heard before, but they're not going to be, it's not AI making up any of those sounds. It's people working with AI and other tools in this kind of, putting sticky tape, in to get that sound. It's like, I mean, it's the people who have the passion and that energy and are energized, as we've just been talking about, to find new ways, find interesting ways to use AI, probably in combination with old technologies as well. That's where something interesting is potentially going to happen. I mean, just one other, just kind of large point, because I'm not an expert on the field, but I mean, it seems to me that the large language model approach is, I mean, it's not really ever going to tell us anything new, is it? Because all it's got is what we already know. So that's what has fed it. So it's the other, as you suggested, the general AGI model, which will be something different to the language model. That then, because then you have the potential that ideas, if we can call them ideas, that we haven't thought before could emerge. But I don't see how new ideas about music that we haven't already thought are going to come out of a blender of all of our ideas about music.
The other question, I think, in terms of looking at futures and AI then, is that if, and as Tom points out, there's a lot of predictions made about futures that are yet to see, but if AI frees us up from work, a lot of the work, replaces a lot of jobs, the idea of that somehow is that we could all live more creative, happy lives. This was the sort of optimistic dream of this thing. So where does music fit? Does it fit in that? Are we more important in that kind of world, or how do we function in that kind of a space, maybe?
I think music is around in times of unrest. Music is around in times of social calamity. Music often fills a really important role those times. I think about the Notre Dame School almost 1,000 years ago, developing polyphony when, meanwhile, 2/3 of Europe are dropping dead from the plague. So music does important stuff. It's not fluff. It's not cheesecake, which is what Steven Pinker called it, evolutionary cheesecake or something like that. But I mean, I have a vested interest, but I do believe that music does its most important work when there are challenges, when we're facing difficulties and uncertainty.
Yeah, could dig into that more maybe, like that was one of the things I was thinking about is like if we're faced with climate change, we're faced with wars in wherever, and humanitarian crises and all these sort of big problems that I think we all feel impacted by. You know, you're going outside, or if I was just being in Berlin on the hottest day ever in Berlin, and you think, wow, okay, these things are happening, or the ice is such in Norway that reindeers can't get through it, and they're starving unless they're fed by someone else, or with feed and stuff. These kind of changes. I mean, where does Is it music's sort of responsibility to engage with that, or how do we feel like we need? Is that our job as musicians, or is it important to us in some way?
Music can engage with that, but it doesn't have to specifically address that to still be part of that conversation and part of that, part of that change and help impetus for change, I guess is what I mean. But you think about like the general mood of people wanting to tune out of stuff and being tired of doom scrolling and so forth. I mean, what is the or you're talking about the youth, kind of having a negative vibes about AI. I mean, what do you do with that? You look for community connection, right? And so you organize community events, and we see that happening all over. Like there's all these little venues that have opened in the last year or so, and people throwing events. People are engaged with mindfulness activities, so they're looking for alternatives, to doom scrolling and social media and so forth. So I mean, one other point. I'm going on a completely different tangent here, but I was thinking about Einstein. I know I'm going completely different direction, but I was thinking about Einstein and that era, of huge scientific innovation at the early part of the 20th century, and just the incredible, groundswell of ideas in that period. And like Einstein was famously played the violin, was very interested in music, but also famously had fairly conservative taste. Like he wasn't interested in the modern music of the early 20th century, So it wasn't. I don't think it's really been thought of as like that was an influence on him. But on the other hand, I feel like, sure, maybe he wasn't into listening to Schoenberg. Maybe that wasn't his thing. But if Schoenberg hadn't written his 5 pieces for orchestra, if he hadn't written Verklärte Nacht, would there have been the environment? Would there have been like that global groundswell of innovation, that like enthusiasm that we were just talking about? Would there have been the environment where he could have come up with those scientific breakthroughs? So I think it's like, Schoenberg, no connection between those pieces and the theory of relativity, but I mean, it's all part of, global, progress, if we want. I don't know.
The energization, or that, that
or maybe
sparking.
Collectively how we imagine culture in the broadest term, that there's lots of cultures that inhabit our lives, and music is perhaps an important one of them. I mean, maybe one of the things also that came up was just sort of about listening. Obviously, the way that each of us write music encourages us to listen quite differently. I think of the length and the tactility, and similar to your music, Tom, it's just maybe that's also relevant to the way that we interact with the world and to deal with things like climate change, is being able to stop and listen, and in terms of that sensory engagement with where we are and in time and place and being in the here and now. Does that sort of ring it?
Can I have a bit of a go at a couple of things? I mean, one of the things about when we talked about post-digital earlier is lifting a veil to get a deeper understanding of something that's underneath. Pulling towards like the AI side of this, the most positive reading I could see at this second is if we can amplify human curiosity. Like we are curious creatures. And I mean, the amount of learning that can be done when you do, I don't know, just want to learn a synthesizer, learn a certain direction, learn music theory, whatever it is, there are some fundamental shifts and changes there, which are less to do with, in my head, about making art, but footsteps towards that and getting people engaged. And this is where, you know, the community thing comes in as well. But then we have to go and remind ourselves, and I'm sure Christopher would agree, that this out there on the, you know, online available information, it has a cost, which is the data centers and all the rest of it. So we also can't blindly subscribe to this. So this is where notions like freedom of access, open source, actually, sure, let's talk about learning music, but let's also talk about learning to code. Do we still need that? I would probably argue yes, especially the way things are going. So there are some like inherent understandings there that I think are really important, and I think they could be really, really important for music and the development of music and having more people engaging with music. So that would be my way of leaning into that.
Yeah, you need to learn how to code in the same way that we still need to learn how to write good essays. That hasn't gone anywhere. And no matter how good AI is at producing that kind of result, we will need the skills. Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is that, oh no, don't worry, lost track, getting tired. Something was in mind and it fell out of my mind.
Maybe the other question then, just following on from that, in terms of community and music making, is looking at Indigenous practice, that the practice that have been here in Australia for tens of thousands of years. If that has any impact on your work specifically? Tom?
Yeah, I just recently have a commission with music for a high school, which I have to get done by October, which will be in consultation with some elders and an Indigenous community group. The thing about that is that I've just told you all I know about it. It's a big, wide open possibility. And maybe once upon a time, I would find that daunting, but it is actually also an adventure. Moving into the unknown is particularly, I think, the role of academics. So, you know, academics, you can think of them in two different ways. The little hunched over in an office being a nerd, or, on the other hand, something more like Indiana Jones, who was also an academic, probably behaved very poorly with Indigenous artefacts, wanting to put them in museums all the time. But that sense of adventure is what I'm getting at. And that is reciprocated.
Yeah.
So the important thing about our responsibilities in this kind of creative work is being conscious of power balances, who's in it for what reason. And if we're conscious about that, and if we're reflective and reflexive in that way, then it can be adventurous. And you can trust that the other people involved are reciprocating, similarly wanting to go on this adventure. And the unknown is the exciting part because the culture is built in that new space. So it is inherently and necessarily a new thing.
Yeah. No, I think all Indigenous practice thinking quite globally here too, in the sense that in imagining these new ways of listening or new ways of connecting, there seem to be possibilities that probably relate to our work in specific ways, perhaps, the tactility of something or the duration of something or the hybridity of something, that these are all locatable in maybe some of these older cultures, perhaps, that we can learn from. I don't, if we feel that's important. John, I'd be curious about that.
I don't think I have anything wonderfully useful to say here, but we have this project called, it's basically regional electronic music making, and we'll be going to a whole bunch of different areas. I don't think I have any documentation that we can actually share, but we've been going to various areas, and we haven't got to several areas in Australia that I would like us to get to, but we are now managing to get imagery and video back of a very diverse array of people using our little tiny red drum machines and things like that, and it's going to allow us to write sociology papers, but it's not going to allow us to do some of the more kind of artistic embracing work yet that I'd like us to be able to do. So sometimes, yes, the tactility, building small, cheap things and being able to send them into a variety of places and have people make beats with them, that's one way. That is one way that's a little bit active of sharing ways of making music and then seeing what people can do with that beyond what people like me and Andrew Brown would think of doing with those machines.
Sure. And Erik, I know you've been travelling around quite a lot.
Yeah, music. Look, I'm always, trying to listen and, learn something from my First Nations colleagues and friends. But specifically, I think the idea of deep listening, of listening to the land, how listening can deepen our understanding of what's going on, these various, in terms of climate change, in terms of some of these, crises we've alluded to in the discussion. Connection to country, walking country, learning about country. That's kind of I'm pretty engaged with now, and then how. And then maybe thinking, just drawing back to the beginning of our discussion, maybe just thinking about how we can apply new technologies or new thinking to maybe just add some additional contribution to that, So like if we're thinking of, listening to ecologies to understand them, we can maybe be thinking in terms of traditional, what traditional approaches we could bring, but also we could be using current recording technologies and AI, bird recognition software, so how can we bring all of these things together to maybe contribute something to the cultural awareness?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Is there bird recognition software? I guess there must be.
Yeah, you go to the Cornell University. It's pretty good now. Sometimes you need to feed in local birds. Yeah. But actually, I've done it recently, and it's pretty solid. Yeah.
So cool. So cool.
That's really wonderful. I guess we're going to have to sort of start to wrap it up a little bit, but I think what's really amazing to me is that the way we all act as musicians, I think that has the impact of the things that we create, that it's just being an active musician, putting things out in the world is going to change the world no matter what it is in a way. But just that how we orient ourselves towards these questions I find absolutely fascinating. So thank you all for sharing your practices and your insights and being part of QCGU Big Ideas today. So thank you very much, Tom, John and Erik.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks for your expert guidance, Ben.